Night Dreams Talk Radio Network brings you The World Paranormal News with James Creechbaum. Now, the latest news.
I'm James Creechbaum with the Paranormal and World Changes News. Well, there was a daytime UFO activity over Los Angeles, California on January 11th of 2020. It's another great 2020 UFO sighting. This one was taken over the city of Los Angeles, California on January 11th, 2020, and it was a daytime sighting. And there's a video that goes with it. Now, the witness briefly reports there was orbs rose from the west. 3 orbs followed by 5 that rose in a group. Caught up to the first 3, then formed a pentagon. They held that shape for minutes before moving on westward. Video of daytime UFO again. This one is over Perth, Australia. Now, the daytime footage of a bright, unidentified flying saucer in the sky above Perth in Australia, and this video was taken on the 25th of December of 2019. The witness goes on to say, my friend tells me she spotted 4 light balls evenly spaced heading directly west, which is leaving the land here and heading out over the ocean. Now, the light balls were spotted about, just a few days before the 25th. Now, the plane had passed, and that is when I could see what appeared to be a round ball object floating above. To the naked eye, it appeared shiny and round. It would change from black to shiny in appearance. And that was on the 25th when the report came in, so it was like the 22nd when it actually sighting. Rise of the apes. Gang of monkeys force panicked villagers to flee their homes. In an Indian village in Narasapuram, the monkeys have reportedly stealed food and ransacking houses, forcing many of the villagers to flee their homes. A total of about 400 monkeys are thought to be involved in an amount defined as population out of control. Also, world's oldest material is older than Earth. Scientists have identified the oldest material ever to make it into our planet, and it even predates the sun. At up to 7 billion years old, these tiny grains of stardust formed at a time before our planet and even our solar system existed at all. The ocean is warming at a rate of 5 atom bombs per second, scientists warn. After analyzing data from the 1950s to 2019, an international team of scientists determined that the average temperature of the world's oceans in 2019 was 0.075 degrees Fahrenheit, higher than the 81 to 2010 average. Now, the amount of heat we have put in the world's oceans in the past 25 years equals to 3.6 billion Hiroshima atomic bombs explosions. Also, scientists reveal the world's first living robots. Researchers have succeeded in creating robots that are made from live animal cells instead of metal and plastics. Now, at what point would they become beings with interests that ought to be protected, said one Oxford Center for Practice Ethics scientist. Also in the news, there's a new discovery of a 430 million year old fossil of a sea creature named after Lovecraft's Cthulhu. Now, in case life imitating art, paleontologists have discovered the fossil that resembles Lovecraft's iconic creature. And because of its likeness to the sea creature described in Lovecraft's novel, they decided to name the fossil after it. Now officially known as Solicicina Cthulhu, the fossil was formally discovered and named. Next news break, top of the hour.
You're listening to Night Dreams Talk Radio After Dark with our host, Gary Anderson.
And that is me. We're just about 1 minute or so from calling Steve, getting him on to talk about UFOs over Las Vegas. I told you, James, I told you that these robots are now creating them from DNA, from living creatures, and they can control them, give it thoughts, and they're self-healing. Like the scientists say, when will they be classified human life? It's kind of interesting. It is really, really scary. And also, the ocean warming up. That is really scary, too, because I think I sent you that over, too, and maybe you found it on the news. But, that is, strange when you think about 5 atomic bombs every minute going off in the ocean for years.
Yeah, it's a total of 3.6 billion of them that's went off, the equivalent to heat up the oceans. And, I've got another little news touch on in the next break. It talks about glaciers and how they're melting, one the size of Florida. So, yeah, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, it is. Well, let's get our guests on the line, and then we're going to, get into, UFOs in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
So we should have them on the line here real quick.
Good evening.
Well, good evening, Steve. How are you doing tonight?
Hello?
Yeah, can you hear us?
Okay, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Well, everybody can hear me with a radio, without a radio, or without the internet. My voice just penetrates through the atmospheric conditions, through the ionic sphere, and bounces back on the Earth.
All right. Well, how are you?
Well, you got an hour. You got about 59 minutes to be totally bored out of your head.
Oh, gosh, no. I'm sure it'll go by so fast.
Oh, yeah. Well, hey, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, Steve?
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, I'm Steve Barone. I live in Las Vegas. I actually grew up in Las Vegas. I'm 65 years old. Moved here for the first time in 1956 when I was 2. My mom and dad were kind of crazy people. I was just thinking about my dad. He grew up in Colorado, and that's the only place he ever lived. But I think when they grew up, they wanted to be wild and crazy, and they moved to Las Vegas. So I lived in both areas quite a few times. They moved back and forth quite a bit. But anyway, in 1972, I joined the Navy. I went in the Navy with a buddy here in Vegas and went back to Little Creek, Virginia, where I was what they call a beach master. And they are on the same base with the Navy Seabees, the Navy SEALs, the assault craft teams, and all of that. So I did 3 years there in the Navy, spent a lot of time in the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. It was actually very fortunate to do that. But anyway, when I got out of the Navy, I came home, and this time was in, I'm sorry, I see another bell ringing. It's just somebody else trying to call. I came back home, and this time it was to Colorado because my parents were living there after I got out of the Navy. And that's when I went to work in the sawmills. I was a logger. I was doing all kinds of stuff. And I realized that there wasn't much of a future for me being a logger. And that's when I moved to California. And I lived in California for about 28 years. And when I was there, I built furniture. I was a carpenter. But the job that I loved the most and the job that I had for the longest was actually in the high-tech industry for a company that doesn't exist anymore called Comag, where we made the memory disks or platters for disk drives.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I was there from 1984 all the way to 2003, or actually 2002. In 2003, I left there for St. George, Utah, so that I could be closer to my family that lives here in Las Vegas and in Kingman, Arizona. What's funny that I just noticed about you, though, is that the other city that my wife and I considered before we went to St. George was Gig Harbor, and that's where you are, if I'm not correct.
Yeah, we're up here on the other side of Tacoma. We're near the Navy Bangor. We're about 15 miles away from Bangor, where the submarines are kept. Yeah, Gig Harbor, Washington. I love it.
Oh yeah, I mean that was just one of the cities on my list, and for whatever reason, St. George won out, so we lived there for 8 years, and then we had a chance to come to Vegas, and we did because if you remember, we had that big subprime market problem, and the value of everything here in Vegas was basically slashed in half. So I knew that if we came here, it was a good investment, because Vegas has always been a bust and boom city, and right now we're in the middle of a boom. But the home that we bought, Gary, was the reason we bought the home was because out of everything that we looked at, it was the one that really stood out to me, just because it had such a wonderful view of the city and even the surrounding mountains, almost all the way around. We're just up higher than all of our neighbors, even the people right next door. And that proved to be an amazing thing. I mean, and up to that point in our lives, we moved here in 2011. Up to that point, I could never actually claim to have seen a UFO before. I never had seen one up to that point, and I always believed in them. I always wished I could have seen one, because you hear all these amazing stories like the Phoenix Lights, all of these incredible stories that, you just can't argue about them, that it happened. There were so many people that saw this thing. But that year, when we moved here to Las Vegas, we moved here in July, and in October, we finally got settled in, and my wife and I took a cruise. And we flew to New York City, got on a cruise ship, and went up the eastern seaboard, all the way up into Canada, ending up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And that was a blast. I mean, we had a good time. Boston, Kennebunkport, all of those places. Well, anyway, when we left our last night in Canada, we got on the ship. We took off for New York City, and that meant a 2-night at sea and showing up in New York City that next morning. Well, about 9:30 the night we left, we had already finished dinner. It was October 13th, 2011. And back then, Gary, I used to smoke. I quit smoking 2.5 years ago. Actually, a little more than 2.5. But if I wasn't a smoker, I would have never seen a UFO, because about 9:30 that night, I went out on our balcony to just have a cigarette, and it was freezing, but I was just sitting there, and out of the corner of my eye, I see something emerging out of the darkness, about maybe 200 feet straight in front of me, coming to the north while we are going south. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing, because it didn't have any lights, any windows, nothing. The only reason I could see it is that we had so many lights on our ship that it was illuminating this object. But it was pretty good size. I would say as big as a large helicopter, but it was perfectly silent. And here's the weird part, is it looked like a gigantic crystal. And as it got towards being even with the back end of the ship, it did like a 45-degree turn